Port Angeles, Washington, May 6, 2004. The harbor was quiet enough that you could hear gulls pick at the pilings and the low hum of a ferry idling beyond the breakwater. Two unmarked sedans turned off Marine Drive and rolled up a short hill above the water. A county unit eased in behind them and went dark. Detective Nora Hastings stepped out in a gray windbreaker, looked once toward the red beacons on the jetty, and climbed the porch steps of a single-story house with cedar shake siding. Beside her, Lieutenant Stephen Rudd from the Washington State Patrol held the thin folder that had come back from a judge the night before. District Attorney Mara Ellison stood off to the side and said nothing. A porch light was still on. The blinds shifted. The door opened to a man in a work jacket. Empty hands, wire-rimmed glasses. He watched the top step as commands came in a calm voice. There was no push, no raised tone. Hinged cuffs clicked once and locked. He did not ask questions. An officer guided him toward the car, one hand on an elbow, the other on the door edge so he wouldn't hit his head as he got in. The street stayed the way it had been a minute before. Damp asphalt, salt in the air, someone's coffee machine hissing 2 houses down. Detective Hastings didn't linger. There are mornings when a department performs a sequence it has practiced for years in other contexts. This was one of those. Sergeant Lynn Tran, the evidence custodian, set a small strip of tape across the porch rail and lifted it enough for Hastings and Rudd to duck under. Felix Carter, a state lab photographer assigned to the warrant team, took 3 frames of the threshold, the latch plate, the hallway beyond. Nothing theatrical, only what the court would need. Inside, a corkboard by the kitchen held the week. Tide times, a ferry schedule, a note about a volunteer drill. Below it sat a plastic bin with tarps folded square and a half-used roll of clear tape on top. A nylon lanyard hung from a hook beside the door. A small orange key float clipped to the end, the kind sold at marine shops so keys don't sink. On the counter, a notepad read in block letters, stamps, tape, gloves. In the shed behind the house, a tape gun hung on a peg above laminated maps of the harbor. In the truck bed, a coil of white nylon rope lay in a tote, the ends heat-sealed smooth. Those details would live later in photographs and bag tags. On this morning, they were only shapes in a room where the air felt colder than outside. The point was not to empty a house. It was to take what connected to a week 4 years earlier when a car was found near the pier before the sun was up, and a young woman didn't come home. A neighbor across the street moved a curtain and stayed out of sight. A jogger checked her pace and kept going. Mara Ellison spoke quietly with Lieutenant Rudd near the curb and left without giving a comment. There would be an arraignment tomorrow and a short advisory with a time and a courtroom. Names other than the defendants had already been decided for that sentence. Naomi Fletcher, the person the file was built around. Ruth Fletcher and Jenna Fletcher, the two who kept her photo printed square and clean even when posters outside faded. Harbor Master Martin Aguilar, whose morning rounds first caught the car in the turnout. Reverend Alma Wayland, who opened a church room to give the family a place to sit out of view when crowds got loud. Dennis Cole and Olivia Park, who worked beside Naomi the night she closed. Detective Hastings stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the 3 items on the counter: a mug with pens, the notepad, the roll of tape. It is not the existence of tape that matters in a coastal town. It is where a specific piece of it once lay. stuck to grit by the driver's door of Naomi's hatchback near the pier, cut awake from the asphalt by backing paper, sealed when people didn't yet have the tools to read what the sticky side kept. 4 years is a long time to wait on a process. The decision to wait had been simple then. No powders, no dyes, keep it cold, and had sounded strange to people who wanted any movement at all. The movement came from a lab bench in Olympia. The reason for handcuffs on a porch came from that bench. The man in the car did not look back as the unmarked unit pulled to the corner. In the jail hallway, a deputy would take a photograph and roll 10 fingers without a word. There would be a phone call to a number already written on a small card from the kitchen. The call would be short. None of it would change what the jury would eventually see. An image pulled from glue on a strip of clear tape, a torn edge that fit another torn edge, a hair pressed in adhesive that told a laboratory about a maternal line. Those pictures do not show anger or fear. They show contact. Hastings stepped through the hallway and kept her eyes on the floor plan. She didn't ask for stories about where the poster boards had come from or who laminated the tide maps or how many times a volunteer drill had met this spring. She could recite those answers from other rooms. The print shop on First Street, where Gretchen Ralston kept a cutter sharp enough to square edges fast. The church basement, where Reverend Whalen stored folding tables on their sides. The auxiliary station, where people in blue shirts logged hours and kept whistles in a bin for safety checks. The person who had been the most visible in those spaces had done what people like that do. Arrive early, stack chairs, keep pens in a line, remind others to walk in pairs, press the corners of flyers flat so wind wouldn't lift them. He had been careful with materials that stick to what they touch. Outside, the harbor moved in its own order. 2 gulls argued over a torn bait bag. A skiff from the Coast Guard station traced the inside edge of the breakwater and turned tight near the ferry lane. The sound carried up the hill as the second warrant team opened the shed. On the pegboard, a utility knife with a red handle. A tape gun with a roll that had been torn rather than cut, the free edge jagged and stiff with dust. On a shelf, laminated maps that would wipe clean with a towel. The house was ordinary in the way houses are when a person's visible life is built from schedules and tasks someone has to do for rooms to run. Hastings walked the outside path to the truck and paused at the bed rail. The tote with white nylon rope was not unusual either. Anyone who has tried to keep volunteers in neat rows on wet stone uses rope. The coil's ends were melted smooth so they wouldn't fray. It makes line handling faster and cleaner. The file had photographs of similar coils in similar totes from long weekends when locals cleaned the breakwater or walked the driftwood field after a storm. The difference here was not a tool. It was a date written on the first page of a lab report and a sequence number beside a photograph of a palm that hadn't been there before. Detective Hastings turned back toward the porch where Sergeant Tran had placed 2 small paper bags on a table and written in clean black ink what each one held. Hastings didn't look inside. There is a point at which a room is no longer a place to think about. It becomes a place to document and leave. The job becomes to carry a short list of items along a path where nothing changes about them except who is responsible. The story that matters moves to a courtroom where a scientist holds a printout of ridges and answers questions in plain English about what is and isn't possible when glue holds skin pattern. Down by the water, Someone on a bicycle stopped at the railing by the pier and took a picture of the morning, unaware of any of this. A ferry horn sounded once. The people who would need to hear news were already on a list, and their calls would be made before a press advisory went out. Jenna Fletcher would answer from work and sit down without finishing her sentence. Ruth Fletcher would listen to the first part and ask the question that comes in families before any other. Will there be a hearing I can attend? Hastings would give a time, not a speech. Mara Ellison would make sure there was a seat near the aisle. The arrest didn't resolve absence. It set up a room where images could be shown and explained without adjectives. In that room, Dennis Cole would say what closing the shop with Naomi looked like. Drawer counted, back door locked, phone call made to her sister, and Olivia Park would describe the tone of a goodbye that didn't give warning of anything wrong. Martin Aguilar would place the car near the pier at dawn. Reverend Wayland would describe a gym and a church hall filled with volunteers who needed someone to tell them where to stand and when to stop for the tide. Those are the scenes people carry around with them, edited down by time to details that anchor memory. The curl of a poster corner lifting in wind, the way a person in a blue shirt pressed it flat with the heel of a hand. Hastings stepped back through the doorway. She had been the one to pick up Ruth's Monday morning calls for years. There is a tone people adopt when they know there is nothing to report and they call anyway. The file had a column of those calls, same day, same time, small notations, so there wouldn't be a week missing from the record when someone asked 5 years later whether the department kept faith. Those notations were not evidence. They were proof of attention. The evidence had always been narrower. 3 short strips of clear tape, a small hair with no root in glue, a plastic buoy float without the apartment key, scuffs on a bumper where a tote could have been lifted and set back down. At the curb, Lieutenant Rudd closed the folder with the judge's orders and looked once more toward the water. The team left the way they had come. No lights, no sound, just tires on wet pavement. Inside the car, the man watched the road. An officer checked a rear-view mirror out of habit and cleared his throat once, softly, to say nothing in particular. The jail sat 10 minutes away. The courtroom where the science would be laid out sat 2 blocks from the coffee shop where Naomi used to work. The lab was across the Sound, an hour and a half by road depending on traffic. The distances were small. By mid-morning, the porch light was off, the door sealed with a signed strip, and a single cruiser remained at the curb. The shed was closed. The truck bed was covered. The harbor moved to its next hour. The items that mattered were already on their way to the place where they would be shown under light and explained without flourish. The people who mattered were making calls or waiting for them, or standing for a few long seconds at a sink with their hands on either side, steadying themselves before they picked up the phone. The week Naomi Fletcher disappeared began as a week she had planned down to small squares in a second-hand planner. Tuition envelope on the top shelf, ferry times copied in block letters for an evening class, Sunday dinner reserved for her mother, Ruth Fletcher, who preferred ground-floor apartments because stairs made her pause on every landing. Naomi worked morning rush and closed when needed. She kept extra pens in a chipped mug by the register, taped a note to herself to bring lemons for tea, and folded tip money into an envelope labeled with the month. At Harbor Grind, She was the person who remembered decaf without saying it out loud. On a Saturday night in June 2000, Naomi closed the drawer with shift manager Dennis Cole, tied the garbage bag, and phoned her sister, Jenna Fletcher, from the store line to say she was locking up and would head home. The call was short. Habit made it feel like a promise. The second call, home, didn't come. Before sunlight, Harbor Patrol Officer Martin Aguilar noticed a hatchback angled in a turnout just shy of the pier. Quiet road, gulls over pilings, water flat enough to mirror the ferry lights. The car was Naomi's. The driver's door sat shut with a thin strip of clear tape caught in the jam like a thread, one end gritty from the pavement. On the ground below, a small plastic key float shaped like a buoy lay on its side. The apartment key it once held was missing. Naomi's work badge sat on the passenger seat. Her canvas tote was on the floor with class notes and a small jar labeled for tuition with a piece of masking tape. Detective Nora Hastings took a slow look at positions, door, curb line, storm drain grate, and kept her voice level when she called Ruth. She did not talk about tape. She said they had the car and were looking for Naomi. Ruth took the phone into the kitchen and did what people do when a call empties the room of air. Set it down, pick it up again, write Naomi's name on a legal pad that didn't need a label. By noon, the gym at the high school looked like it does in towns when someone is late and then missing. Folding tables, sign-in sheets, coffee that tastes like the filter. Jenna printed Naomi's photo on the school copier and squared the edges with scissors. Reverend Alma Wayland opened the church hall for overflow and for a quiet back room where Ruth could sit when the bigger room got loud. Volunteers filed in, signed names, took maps. The instruction they heard was simple and repeated until everyone could say it back. Walk the line, flag what you find. Do not touch. Harbor Grind kept a copy of the flyer above the syrup rack where Naomi's hands had been every day. Dennis Cole taped it flat along all four sides so corners wouldn't lift. Olivia Park checked the back walk and the alley where staff sometimes paused before getting into cars. In the apartment Naomi shared with a friend who worked nights, the bed was made. A grocery list on the fridge read, milk, brown rice, lemons. A postcard with a ferry schedule leaned against the mug with pens. A jacket Naomi wore most nights was missing from its peg. Port Angeles is small enough that names repeat across jobs. Ferry clerk Dana Klein checked passenger lists for a person walking on in the last hour. No match. A convenience store camera captured a silver car at the wrong minute because the clerk, Brandon Shue, had reset the clock 2 days earlier. A marine terminal camera pointed the wrong way. The cafe's tape system recycled itself by morning. Those are ordinary gaps for 2000. They sit in files as reasons a picture stays partial. The first search lines took the footpath under the pier and the driftwood fields that run along the breakwater. Coast Guard auxiliary boats made short passes along the inside edge where light hits debris different at low tide. Harbor Master Aguilar marked tide windows on a whiteboard so people could see when areas would be exposed again. Kayak club members checked the quiet water behind the ferry slip. On the rocks, someone found a jacket from a tourist shop. The wrong size and wrong brand. A fisherman brought in a key ring corroded black, wrong make. A purse turned up wedged under riprap that belonged to someone who had mislaid it weeks earlier. The file recorded each item and put it aside. Ruth sat where she could see a doorway and kept her hands on either side of a paper she didn't read. Jenna took posters to the laundromat, the post office, the campus center. People who only knew Naomi by coffee orders spoke her name like they had known it a long time. When the first wave of volunteers wore down, a second wave came. The Coast Guard station approved extra shoreline passes at different tides. Harbor pilot Neil Sutter offered a skiff when boats were short. One person arrived with order in a tote. Thomas Keegan, a deacon at Harbor Lighthouse Church and a uniformed volunteer with the auxiliary, laid out laminated tide maps, clipboards, a roll of clear tape, and a bag of plastic whistles. He kept sign-out lists neat, reminded people to pair up, and fixed curling flyers with tape he tore on the diagonal and pressed flat with the heel of his hand. He asked Jenna which number she wanted on the bottom line, and wrote it there in block letters, so even a tired person could read it fast. When Ruth came through the gym doors with a stack from the church copier, he took the weight from her arms and slid the pages into sleeves so the edges wouldn't shred in wind. Detective Hastings worked the two tracks that matter early: Naomi's last known movements and the piece of road where the car was found. Dennis Cole described the close. Drawer counted, door locked, Naomi's call to Jenna on the way out. Olivia Park said there had been no argument, nothing unusual. Erica Barton from Naomi's evening class said they had swapped anatomy notes and planned to meet the next week. Nothing in those statements changed the shape of the week. They made the person in it clearer. At the pier turnout, the detail that would decide the case did not look like anything to people leaning over the tape line. Pieces of clear carton tape were on the ground and in the door jamb. Adhesive holds what it touches. In that year, many departments still dusted the non-sticky side and hoped for a smudge to lift. Hastings chose a different line. Leave the sticky side alone, protect it with backing paper, keep it cold, and wait for a method that could make invisible prints on glue visible without wiping away what the glue kept. The decision read like inaction in the gym, where people wanted anything you could hold up and say, "Found." It read like care at the bench later. Small missteps were owned and written down. A patrol officer cupped gloved hands to the glass for a better angle before the line went up. The gloves were bagged. The car left the turnout for a secure bay before a daylight sweep under the tire tracks because public space isn't a controlled space. It's a trade many departments make. A camera that might have helped had already taped over itself. None of that stopped the case from moving. It set limits everyone could see. Searches became scenes people still talk about in quiet rooms. Lines on the rocks at dusk, headlamps bobbing, the sound of gulls and the water knocking pilings. Reverend Wayland stood at the table with a clipboard and told people what to expect if fog came in. Gretchen Ralston, who owned the print shop on First Street, ran off extra copies free and squared the edges with a cutter she kept sharp. Captain Wallace Pierce from the Coast Guard station sent 2 members to help map the driftwood fields with flags. Keegan showed a group of teenagers how far apart to stand so they could see each other without stepping into the same shadows. He kept a pocket notebook with columns, name, time out, time back, and aligned the digits as if the page itself had to hold steady, because so much else didn't. Ruth held to a routine that made sense when nothing else did. Sunday dinners stayed on the calendar even when the second plate went into the fridge wrapped in foil. Monday calls to the detective went out at the same hour. Jenna kept poster sleeves in a paper bag under the front seat and replaced copies as sun faded them. When corners lifted in wind, someone's palm pressed them flat. Tear, place, press. It is an ordinary motion in a coastal town. It made a difference later that for one set of tape, the print stayed on the sticky side and the lab had a way to see it. The first vigil came fast. Harbor grind closed early. Staff walked the pier as a group. People held candles that guttered at the first breeze until someone taped paper wind guards to the cups. The prayer was short. No speeches. Reverend Wayland read a psalm and ended on a line about steady hands doing small work. Afterwards, Keegan coiled cords and stacked chairs without being asked. He did not give interviews. He told a reporter she could find Detective Hastings by the table and stepped back. Weeks became months in the way open cases do in towns that keep showing up. New volunteers arrived with lists from church bulletins. People checked their outbuildings again, not because they expected a result, but because routines remember better than people do. The driftwood fields reorganized themselves with the season. When fall brought the first storms, a new line of debris scratched higher up the rocks. Search and rescue cut salal under the bluff where people stashed stolen purses. Naomi's face stayed on the ferry lot board, straightened and retaped by whoever saw it peeling first. The file thickened in small, exact ways. Hastings wrote down what didn't change. Last call after close. Hatchback at the turnout before sunrise. Tape at the driver's door. Key float without the apartment key. No bank activity. No call logs after the first call. A hair stuck in glue with no route to tell a lab the body's nuclear DNA, but enough for a maternal line if technology allowed. District Attorney Mara Ellison asked the state lab to keep the adhesive surfaces untouched and to hold the hair for a mitochondrial test. The lab said it could hold both and would wait for instrument time rather than consume them on older methods that wouldn't answer the right questions. The harbor gave back pieces of other days and nothing of Naomi's. A cooler lid. A child's shoe from last summer. A broken oar. A jacket stiff with diesel. Each time a bag came back to the gym table, Keegan raised a hand, kept people from opening it, and waited for an officer. He taped down corners on new posters and wrote fresh dates in the corner in small letters. He did the hours most people avoid, scraping old tape residue off poles with a utility knife so new tape would hold, cutting edges straight so sleeves sat square, making sure each pen on the sign-in table had ink. Ruth's phone calls never slipped a week. If Hastings didn't answer on the first ring, she called back in 5 minutes. The answers were consistent and short. Nothing new, still working. We will call first if something breaks. You don't need to hear it from anyone else. In the evenings, Jenna took the busier corners of town and replaced copies in high-traffic places. She kept a spare in her bag for the ferry window, because gusts took that one first. Keegan learned her route without being told, and stocked the same corners so she didn't have to double back. A few times, people called in stories that turned into versions of hope. A cashier in Forks believed she had seen Naomi in a gray sweatshirt. A driver on Highway 101 remembered a hitchhiker. A neighbor swore she had heard a door at the wrong hour 2 nights running. Officers took the calls, drove the miles, sat on couches, watched camera footage with timestamps that drifted by 2 or 3 minutes and didn't matter. Each story narrowed to nothing. The file kept their names anyway. Cases carry the weight of what is not true, so the parts that are can stand by themselves. There were moments when the work in the gym and on the rocks came close to saying aloud what no one wanted to say. A map rolled out on the table. A pen tapped against a square of shoreline already walked twice, and a voice asking if they should stop calling for daylight passes and keep one-night line going instead. Reverend Whalen's answer set the tone. "We use all the hours we have." People nodded. They signed up. They kept enough light to see where feet were going. Keegan's tone never changed in public. He put resources where they could be used and stayed at the edge of every camera frame. He put a chair behind Ruth's so she could lean back. He showed her where lines had gone and where they would go next. He never offered outcomes. He delivered motion. On a slow Tuesday, he met Jenna at the ferry lot to rehang a poster that had torn loose. He tore tape, pressed it, smoothed it with his palm, and told her he'd come back after work to check corners. He spoke about wind and metal and adhesive like he was talking about weather. Winter closed the water's surface. The first snow stayed for a day and made the rocks look cleaner than they were. The gym emptied and refilled in smaller cycles. The church hall moved folding tables back to their usual places, but kept a box of sleeves and a stack of posters on a shelf marked with Naomi's name. At Harbor Grind, customers left tip money in a jar marked for printing. The woman who owned the print shop, Gretchen Ralston, stopped asking for payments and started stapling receipts to envelopes so there would be a record anyway. Hastings sent a spring memo to Lieutenant Stephen Rudd at the Washington State Patrol, asking that the preserved tape be placed in line for the new adhesive method Dr. Karen Albright's unit was bringing online. The language was plain by design. 3 short, sticky-side fragments collected at the driver's door and sealed the first week. No powders, no dyes, a hair pressed into glue. A family willing to provide a maternal reference if needed. The reply was simple too. Hold steady. Instrument time would open. The method would be run when it could be run. The items would not be touched before that. None of these steps felt like progress in a room where people wanted a direction to walk. They looked like maintenance. Keeping a door closed is not dramatic. Neither is signing a seal across a bag and putting it back on a shelf. But the case depended on the difference between what gets handled and what does not. It depended on someone not dusting adhesive for a quick answer that would have erased a better one. It depended on a hair with no root sitting flat, until a lab could read the line that lives in mitochondria and points to a family rather than a person. In spring, the harbor changed sound. Water against the rocks replaced winter wind in door frames. New volunteers joined, students mostly, with time between classes. Jenna brought copies to the campus board and taped them in rows so the faces sat straight. She talked less to strangers and more to Detective Hastings in short, exact sentences that saved everyone effort. Ruth kept Sunday dinner for 2 and carried a plate to the fridge each week with muscle memory. She stopped opening the legal pad when she made Monday calls. The questions stayed the same. The public story thinned to a paragraph. The private one became it. A car at the pier with a strip of clear tape hanging in the jam. A small buoy float on the asphalt without the apartment key. A work badge on the passenger seat. A hair pressed in glue. A decision to wait for a method that didn't exist in the county when Naomi vanished. The gym table lost its pile of sign-in sheets. It kept a small stack of sleeves and a jar of pens. The church hall kept one poster taped inside a closet door where wind couldn't reach it. Harbor Grind kept the photo above the syrup rack. There was a morning in early summer when Ruth walked the pier with Jenna before the first commuters. Fog sat low over the water. The poster on the railing had lifted at one corner. Ruth held it still with her fingertips while Jenna reached for a roll of tape. A man in a blue shirt, one of the regulars at the table with maps, stepped close enough to help and then waited for Jenna to press the strip down herself. The motion was automatic. Tear, place, press, smooth. Ruth watched the hand flatten the tape and did not say anything. She looked at the water and then at the flyer and then at Jenna's face. The harbor sounded the way it always had. The difference was in the habit people had learned. When a corner lifted, someone pressed it flat, and the city kept moving. Thomas Keegan occupied the center of the room without ever taking the center of the frame. At Harbor Lighthouse Church, he was the deacon with the key ring, the one who knew which breaker fed the gym lights and where the extra coffee filters lived. With the Coast Guard Auxiliary, he was the steady volunteer who spoke in short sentences about tide and swell and why pairs stay within voice range. He had a way of arriving at the table before anyone asked for him, tote already open, maps laid out. He learned names fast. He called Harbor Patrol Martin Aguilar Skipper once and never again. He called Jenna Fletcher Miss Fletcher until she told him not to, then used Jenna. He called Reverend Alma Wayland Pastor, even when she said first names were fine. He pronounced Ruth Fletcher as if he had rehearsed it, soft on the end, and met her eyes longer than most people could hold. He placed her chair where she could see the door and angled the lamp to cut glare on the laminated map. He set a small bowl of wrapped mints on the corner of the table without asking. Those details looked like care. In a file they read as practice. At the gym he made columns, name, time out, time back, and kept a thick pen that didn't skip. He stacked clipboards so the left edge sat flush. He squared flyers inside sleeves and ran a strip of clear tape along every side so wind wouldn't work a corner loose. He tore tape with a diagonal snap and pressed it flat with the heel of his left hand, smoothing from center to edge until air bubbles vanished. When the roll snagged, he twisted his wrist and the free end tore into a jagged tooth that he ignored and used anyway. It was efficient. The tape stuck. On the rocks, he talked about footing first. He showed teenagers how to step from dry to wet stone without sliding and handed out whistles on nylon lanyards. He tied a bright line along the driftwood field so volunteers could keep orientation when fog came. He melted the ends of the white cord with a lighter so they wouldn't fray. A neat finish that made knots lie close and clean. He gave instructions that sounded like habits learned on docks. Whistle twice if you find something and don't move. Whistle once if you need a hand. Don't cluster. Don't talk over surf. He walked beside Jenna when she updated posters at the ferry lot after work. Close enough to help, but far enough not to crowd. He carried sleeves and tape and a small towel. He held the poster in place while she lined the edges and stood back so she could tear the strip herself. When she asked for a number to reach him, he wrote the church office and underlined it once. When she thanked him, he said, "We keep the edges down," like that was the only job. In Harbor Grind, he kept his distance. He ordered coffee, black, paid cash, and slid bills into the tip jar marked for printing. Dennis Cole saw him study the new poster on the door after closing. tilt his head to avoid reflection, and run a finger along the bottom edge to test the seal. Olivia Park remembered him pausing just long enough to ask whether the department needed more whistles for shoreline shifts, and whether the store had spare sleeves in back. He did not linger. He stood outside and watched people read the board and defer to them when they reached for the door. He never crossed the tape at the pier. If a volunteer approached the line with a found item, he raised one hand, palm out, and made space until an officer arrived. He was strict about it. "Flag and call," he repeated, same words the briefings used. He kept a roll of survey flags in his tote and pushed the end into gravel with the toe of his boot to mark a spot without bending. His restraint made him safe to deputize in small ways. Keep the table ordered, keep the line moving, keep the posters up. In a town like Port Angeles, access is function. Keegan had it. He could unlock the church hall without waiting for staff. He knew the harbor master's schedule and could time shoreline passes for slack tide without asking anyone to check a chart. He knew which copier at the high school fed straighter and didn't wrinkle sleeves. He walked through a side door at the auxiliary station and came out with a box of glow sticks and 3 headlamps with fresh batteries. He called Gretchen Ralston at the print shop after hours, and she opened the back door and ran a new stack of posters while he scraped old adhesive off poles with a utility knife. The moments that stand out now read as ordinary then. On a chill morning, he met Ruth and Jenna at the pier and turned the laminated map so north matched the water before speaking. He traced 3 sectors with a capped pen. "Covered," he said, then traced 2 more. "Repeat at evening low." He did not tell Ruth where not to look. He told her where people had been and where they would go. He did not place himself at the car. He located everyone else. He absorbed thanks with a nod and moved on. Reverend Whalen thanked him for chairs and cords, and he said, "Whatever you need." Captain Wallace Pierce thanked the auxiliary crew for extra shoreline watch, and he answered, "Whenever the schedule allows." He accepted credit and passed it to a group so it never seemed to attach. That habit kept him unspecific in memory. He was always the helper and never the source. He mapped more than water. He mapped attention. When an out-of-town reporter asked for a quick interview, he pointed to Detective Nora Hastings and stepped to the side. When a volunteer started a story in front of a camera about something found and then nothing, he tapped the line on the floor with his boot, and the person stopped and looked down and said he'd tell an officer instead. He kept the room from generating noise that would need to be walked back later. That made him useful to a department that did not have time to stage scenes. There were edges to his helpfulness that made sense at the time. He had strong opinions about where to put people and where not to. He avoided the narrow strip between the pier's rail and the turnout berm, said it was too tight a space for civilians, and that one slip would put a volunteer in the lane. He steered night passes away from the driver's side of Naomi's car's last position, citing glare from traffic and the hazard of working that close to the road. He was right about safety. He was also shaping movement. Dennis Cole remembered a brief exchange with Naomi weeks before the disappearance. It wasn't an argument. Keegan had stopped in near closing and offered to carry a box to the curb. Naomi said she had it. He asked if she needed a ride. She said her sister would call. He nodded and left. The file didn't elevate the moment. It sits in a paragraph about routines at the café and a worker who told customers no when no was the answer. There were other small refusals. Erica Barton remembered Keegan asking outside the campus center if Naomi was in their study group. Erica said yes. He asked what hour. She said end of the day and smiled because people ask that when they're planning the work. She didn't think of it again until a detective called months later and asked her to list who had ever asked that question. She wrote the names down: 2 students, a tutor, and a man from the harbor she had seen 3 or 4 times near the Commons. Keegan used language that made actions sound procedural rather than personal. He didn't say, "I'll go with you." He said, "I'll walk that sector." He didn't say, "I'll call tonight." He said, "I'll verify low tide windows and return with a plan." He didn't say, "Let me carry that." He said, "We can reallocate weight." That diction belongs to policy and training, and it sits comfortably in rooms run by boards and minutes. It also keeps people from hearing the person under the words. He put himself between the family and small tasks that make waiting worse. He ran interference when well-meaning neighbors asked Ruth for stories she didn't want to tell. He took a parking ticket off Jenna's windshield and paid it with a church check, then handed her the receipt and said he'd handle the rest. He smoothed the corner of a flyer with his palm when Ruth looked away so it wouldn't catch wind and tear. He found small ways to make the world neat. Those pieces mattered to a mother and a sister who were living through hours that did not. When the first fall storm came through, volunteers tugged at poster corners softened by rain. Keegan cut new sleeves and fed them over paper like a person wrapping books. He wrote dates in small black numbers at the bottom of each copy so lines stayed current. He worked the schedule the way a person with a ledger works: blocks of time, tasks complete, receipts kept in a labeled envelope. His calm made other people breathe again. Calm is a skill. It reads as virtue until a lab puts a palm on glue. Detectives spoke to him as they spoke to anyone who handled shared equipment. He gave elimination prints and a swab and signed his name. He did not resist. He answered the set of standard questions without adding detail. He stayed inside the edge of what was asked and did not step farther. The notes from those interviews looked like a copied form. Lines filled, no commentary. He ran Sunday cleanup days that doubled as searches. He brought tarps and cord and a list of stretches of rail that needed posters replaced. He placed Jenna with pairs who would walk where wind lifted edges first. He kept Ruth in the room where she could sit and be close, but not be addressed by everyone at once. He called Gretchen Ralston for more ink when the copier went light. He returned to the ferry lot after dark to press down corners he knew would be up by morning. He took no credit. He went home late and set his tote by the door for the next day. He maintained lines that held even under pressure. Reverend Whalen pointed out after the fact that he rarely stood with his back to a door. He found the corners of rooms where he could see both the entrance and the table. He watched people returning from shorelines and noted who would need warm gloves next time and who would forget to sign back in. He tapped a pen against his block and wrote names without looking down. The family's gratitude is in the record. Jenna wrote a note on church letterhead thanking the deacons for opening the hall. She named Keegan and 2 others. Ruth sent a card to the auxiliary station making that thanks official. The station posted it on a bulletin board in a hallway people walked past on the way to check radios. Keegan took a photograph of it in the hall when no one was looking and put the print in his pocket. That image sits in a drawer now, the edges of the paper worn where fingers held it. He organized a candle walk along the pier. He measured distance between volunteers so the line wouldn't bunch, and had tape ready to fix paper guards to cups. He put a chair behind Ruth and a folding table beside her so she could settle her hands. He lifted the microphone once to check whether it buzzed and wrapped the cord around the stand so it wouldn't catch on someone's feet. He didn't speak into it. He nodded at Reverend Wayland and she stepped up. He stepped back. He pressed a strip of tape flat on a flyer that had started to peel on the rail just behind the pastor's shoulder while people bowed their heads. When the gym quieted down in winter, he kept bringing a tote with supplies, as if any night could become the one where lines were needed again. He kept the same roll of clear tape in the same pocket of the tote and tore it with the same hand. He carried a coil of white nylon sealed at the ends and tied it to chair legs when he needed to keep a walkway clear. He showed a teenager how to tie and untie a knot with one pull and told him to practice until it was muscle memory. He asked what the boy's name was and used it 3 times in a row so he wouldn't forget it. He became the person other helpers called when the edge of the poster lifted or the sign-in sheet ran out of lines. They called the church office and asked for Thomas Keegan, and the secretary passed along the message. He took the note and said, "We'll keep the edges down." He said it 100 times and it meant the same. Hold the place where the paper meets metal. Keep it flat. Keep the picture visible. Keep the line from catching wind. He stayed visible for 4 years. The tide charts changed. Ferry schedules shifted. The print shop replaced a cutter blade. The harbor's sound moved from winter clatter to summer slap and back. Ruth kept Sunday dinner at 2 places and put 1 plate in the fridge, then stopped and kept only 1. Jenna stopped telling people what she was doing and did it. Detective Hastings kept answering Monday calls without changing the answer. Keegan kept setting mints on a map for a mother, kept the poster corners flat, kept the sign-in grid aligned, kept the rope neat, kept his voice low and even. Nothing about those tasks broke trust in real time. They were the reason rooms stayed organized. The break came from outside the room, in a laboratory where a palm appeared on glue and a torn tape edge found its match. Only then did small habits rearrange themselves into a pattern. The practiced heel-of-hand press, the diagonal tear, the jagged free end, the insistence on steering night lines away from the narrow strip where a car door had been. The kind of help that kept people moving just far enough from the only place that mattered. The evidence that moved in boxes did not change for 4 years. 3 short strips of clear tape cut from grit by the driver's door of Naomi Fletcher's car, a hair pressed into glue with no visible root, and a plastic buoy float without the apartment key that once hung from it. What changed sat on a bench in Olympia, where Dr. Karen Albright's unit at the Washington State Patrol Laboratory ran an adhesive process built for the thing everyone had waited on, the sticky side. Explained simply, the method turns the invisible on glue into something you can see and photograph. The lab processed the fragments one at a time, kept the sticky faces uncontaminated, and shot each stage so no one would need to imagine what happened. On one strip, the ridges from the heel of a left hand appeared, the hypothenar area, clear enough to map ridge flow and points. It was not a smudge on glass. It was a palm on glue from tape lifted inches from the driver's threshold. Detective Nora Hastings gathered full palm exemplars from a short list of people whose names lived in the file for practical reasons. Harbor staff, early volunteers who handled shared gear, and the auxiliary member who drew sectors and arrived with tape and rope. The lab compared the adhesive side image to those exemplars and wrote the sentence the case had been waiting for. The latent palm matched Thomas Keegan's left hand. A second photograph series answered a quieter question. Could one torn edge be mated to another? One strip had a jagged break where it had been ripped rather than cut. Under the shed warrant, the team had photographed a tape gun with a partially used roll. Under magnification, the torn free end on that roll interlocked with a fragment from Naomi's car the way two halves of the same tier do. End match is not a brand label. It is the shape of damage. The lab showed the fit and recorded it. The third result was limited and still decisive when placed beside the first two. The hair and glue carried mitochondrial DNA, maternal line only. It matched Thomas Keegan's maternal lineage. Alone, that finding names a family, not a person. Placed next to a palm on glue and a tear that found its partner in his shed. The narrowing left little air in the room. District Attorney Mara Ellison filed charges in Clallam County. Murder in the first degree under a felony theory and kidnapping. Judge Patrick Lyle read the counts at arraignment, set the calendar, and told counsel the jury would hear from the laboratory if the court admitted the methods. No one raised a voice. Jenna Fletcher kept her hands tight around a copy of the pier flyer. Ruth Fletcher sat in the aisle seat the court had set aside and looked at the floor when the defendant was asked for a plea. Pre-trial hearings kept to the point a jury could understand. Dr. Albright testified that the adhesive method reveals prints on sticky surfaces without scraping away what the glue preserved. She put up the palm image in a light box and laid a transparency of Keegan's left-hand exemplar over it, point to point. A second analyst demonstrated the end-match series, sliding torn edges together under the camera until the peaks and valleys aligned. A DNA scientist explained mitochondrial testing in plain words. It can't single out one man, but it can exclude most men and include his maternal line. The court allowed the evidence with limits stated where they belonged. Trial began in a room that was smaller than the case felt to the town. The state story was short and didn't need drama. Dennis Cole and Olivia Park took jurors through the last minutes at Harbor Grind. The drawer, the back door, the call to Jenna. Harbor Master Martin Aguilar placed the car at the turnout before dawn. Detective Hastings showed photographs of the door area where tape had been lifted and the buoy float lay on asphalt. She gave the one time that mattered. Naomi's last call at night. No call after. She explained the choice to leave the sticky side alone when some departments might have rushed to dust the non-adhesive face for a partial smudge. We waited, she said, so the glue could speak when the lab had a way to hear it. The lab testimony was the spine. The palm on adhesive matched Thomas Keegan's left hand. The torn edge from the pier matched the torn edge on the roll in his shed. The hair and glue matched his maternal line. The analysts didn't speculate about why tape was near Naomi's car or when the shed roll had been torn. They said what the pictures showed and what the sequences meant, and stopped. Mara Ellison added what the town knew in its bones. Reverend Alma Wayland described the gym and the church hall, the sign in rows, the quiet room for Ruth. Volunteers told the jury about tape corners pressed flat by a calm hand, laminated tide maps, white nylon cord with melted ends, whistles on lanyards, and the man who knew where to put people and when to pull them back for safety. None of that proved a crime. It proved proximity, routine, and a practiced way of handling the same materials that later carried his hand. The defense gave the argument that exists wherever tape and rope are common. Counsel Eric Dunn said the harbor touches many hands, that adhesive picks up what it meets, that secondary transfer is possible. He said NMAT shows only that a roll and a fragment were once one, not when. He said mitochondrial DNA is a family, not a fingerprint. He placed Keegan at the gym table and on the rocks, and asked jurors to believe those scenes could not live beside the lab's images. On rebuttal, the state didn't change tone. Dr. Albright explained that the palm was on glue protected from day one, not on metal or glass touched by crowds. Ridge clarity and feature count were consistent with direct contact, not a lifted trace. The torn edge demonstration spoke for itself. The hair's maternal line was framed as corroboration, not the lead. Hastings added the detail that kept the scene grounded. The strips were collected before public handling, inches from the driver's threshold where Naomi would have stood to get in. "There are places on a pier where many hands go," she said. "This isn't one of them." Jurors asked for the palm overlay again in deliberation. They returned with guilty verdicts for murder in the first degree and kidnapping. When they were polled one by one, each said yes. The sound in the room was paper and breath. At sentencing, Ruth Fletcher stood at the lectern and read from a single page. She did not look left. She said Sunday dinner stayed on the calendar even when one plate went into the fridge and no one came to eat it. She said she kept a postcard with a ferry schedule in a mug by the sink because Naomi liked to know crossings by heart. She said she answered the phone at the same time each night for months because muscle memory is stronger than reason. Jenna Fletcher spoke after her. She said the posters had done what they could, kept a face where people could see it until the courtroom took over the work. Judge Lyle imposed life imprisonment for first-degree murder. The kidnapping count was addressed under the law, so the judgment carried one sentence that did not have space for daylight. The court ordered the tape fragments, shed roll, palm exemplars, photographs, and sequence reports retained under seal. There were no remarks from the defendant. A bailiff closed the door. What motive names itself in a file like this? There was no confession. The state's theory was the one detectives had written carefully. Attention Naomi never invited. Read as permission by a man used to organizing other people. A polite refusal that held. Control taken back with planning and speed when she left work alone. And then months and years of visible service that kept lines tight and volunteers just off the only strip of ground that mattered. The law does not require jurors to fix a reason when contact and opportunity are enough. Still, the jury heard the line because it fit the pattern the evidence drew. Outside court, District Attorney Ellison read 2 paragraphs and named the units that had held the case together when nothing moved. Port Angeles Police Department, Clallam County Sheriff's Office, Washington State Patrol Laboratory, the Coast Guard Station. She named people as well: Hastings, Sergeant Lynn Tran, Lieutenant Stephen Rudd, Albright. She did not take questions about motive. She did not need to. Rooms adjusted. Harbor Lighthouse Church removed a name from a deacon board and wrote a letter to the auxiliary station. The auxiliary updated a roster. Harbor Grind kept Naomi's photo in a small frame by the register with a note about a scholarship at Peninsula College for medical assistant students in her name. Gretchen Ralston slid the last laminated poster into a folder and shut the cabinet. The pier railing went bare. People who had learned to check corners for lifting tape still smoothed notices flat as they passed. The motion meant what it had always meant. Keep what matters visible. The file closed without adjectives. It carried photographs of a palm on glue and a torn edge that would only fit one way. It carried a line of code from a hair that could not lie about its mother's mother. It carried a list of Monday calls that never slipped a week. It carried the names of a mother and a sister who showed up when showing up was the only thing left. It carried the hours a town spent walking the line because someone had to. It left out guesswork and kept what the adhesive and the camera and the courtroom could hold. There is no good ending to absence. There is a lawful one to harm. In Port Angeles, the harbor kept its schedule. The ferry horns sounded at their marks, and a quiet man who had always been early to the table went where the state sends people after a verdict like this. Ruth cooked on Sundays for as long as it helped. Jenna put the sleeves and tape in a closet and closed the door. The science did what the search could not. The rest is the relief people don't admit to out loud. That a person who stood inches from the place Naomi should have been had finally been moved out of the picture, and that a palm pressed into glue carried enough truth to get it done.